Good morning and welcome to the Police and Crime Committee today. We will be holding a question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence have been received
good
today.
News. Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, jolly good. Can we note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings? Good, thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, the question and answer session with MOPAC and the Metropolitan Police Service. So I'd like to welcome Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner for the Police of the Metropolis, who is appearing before the committee for the first time since his appointment. Welcome. And of course to welcome to Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. So welcome to this first meeting, Sir Mark Rowley. Would you like to spell out to us your aims, your ambitions, and of course what your priorities will be going forward?
Thank you very much, and good to be back here with you. So 5 years probably since I was last in front of this committee. One or two familiar faces and some new ones, but I look forward to working with you. It's a great privilege to be back in policing, and I surprised myself how much I wanted to come back and how much policing still matters to me, and obviously I realised how much it matters to London. And there's an awful lot for us to do. So I'm going to spend about sort of just 15 minutes, and I'm grateful for the opportunity just to sort of lay out sort of my thinking as I arrive and some of the things we're doing at the moment, and hopefully that can feed into the conversation and the questions and answers that follow. First of all, though, I think it's whilst we're an organisation at a difficult moment in our history, and there's lots of challenges to be met, and I'm sure we're talking about those, we have a sort of amazing body of men and women, the majority, who are fantastic people. And I think the way the team policed the funeral of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth was an extraordinary example of what a great organisation the Metropolitan Police and what it can achieve at its best. Our biggest ever security operation with over 10,000 people, bigger on sort of one day than for the Olympics or the Platinum Jubilee. And it was a real privilege to have policing doing that, and we had police officers also helping us from every force across the country, and it was a really impressive event. The level of detail of work behind the scenes of police officers and staff was extraordinary, and you sort of got the very visible, polished front, and then behind the scenes, a bit like the Swan. There's the Swan on the surface, but the speed the legs were moving under the surface was pretty. A pretty extraordinary rate at times, and a call out for staff colleagues as well who did help with a lot of logistics behind the scenes. I think one colleague sort of on day one sort of started the hotel room. So I think we booked about 45,000 hotel room nights in over 10 days, just because you've got so many people moving around the country on mutual aid. So just the logistics of doing that. Imagine being the person asked, can you sort that out, please? So clearly there's been practice and things beforehand, but it just illustrates the whole team met. There's some visible things and some great things behind it as well. So that's a great example of what we can achieve. But I do realise I arrive at a time when we've got some real challenges. I know we're going to be talking about the engage process with HMIC, and you've seen over the last 4 years as London's confidence in the Met has gone down. I think this is the number that has really struck me is pretty much a straight line fall over the last 4 years in terms of that survey data that MOPAC do around confidence in local policing, where it's dropped from high 60s to high 40s, and there's some particular communities and particular geographies where it's much lower than that. So there's a lot to do. So I've been clear that sort of my mission for my commissionership is more trust, less crime, and high standards. And I'm not going to waver from that. That's where we're sitting out on. I think particularly when a big organisation has challenges, you need absolute clarity what's important. More trust, less crime, high standards. That's what you'll hear from me for the next 5 years. That's about rebuilding, renewing policing by consent. the British model of policing sort of arguably sort of first formalised nearly 200 years ago with the foundation of the Metropolitan Police was the idea of policing by consent, that policing is best done with communities and is not about, it's not a paramilitary force, it's best done with communities. The best quote of Peel in that context is the one about the police are the public and the public are the police. The police are simply members of the public paid to give full-time attention to the duties incumbent on every citizen. And that's what we need to be about. Policing by consent as we approach maybe our 200th anniversary in 7 years' time, policing by consent in this century, how you do it will be very different to what made sense in 1829. But the philosophy must be the same. So we have to find a way to renew that in a London which is far bigger, far more complex societies, where the online world has such an effect on crime and society in so many different ways. We have to find a way to do that in a different way that works for today in this great globalised city. But the mission has to be the same. So how are we going to go about that? So the way I'm setting out to do that is we need to hit the ground hard and running, and sort of people have heard sort of mention about a 100-day plan. And really that for me is just starting to put some shape around getting moving. There's no pretense we're going to fix everything and be perfect in 100 days. But I think when a big, proud organisation is at a difficult time, you can't spend forever strategising. You have to get on and do some things and build your plans alongside it. So I don't apologise for getting on and doing some things, and I'm sure the stuff we do in sort of the first 100 days, a lot of it will work, maybe some bits won't, and our strategy and long-term planning will build over time. But given Londoners' feedback on the policing of the city, we need to get on with things, and that's what we're trying to do. It's starting to show that we can be better, we can be different, and giving ourselves time alongside that to build a more sort of mature, rounded, longer-term plan, as you'd expect from us. And within this, I have 5 sort of strands that we're working to, and I think these will largely be reflected probably in long-term strategy, but I'm sure they'll develop. The first one is probably the one that's most annoying to have to spend time on, frankly. It's our foundations of integrity. Clearly, and there's been too many cases where we have had examples of officers behaving appallingly through serious criminality. Many of them involve sort of racism, misogyny, homophobia, ableism, and they're awful. And we all know a big organisation of 45,000 people can't be perfect, but you would rightly expect of us that we're sort of ruthless and determined at trying to be so. And I think the evidence from these cases, and Louis' cases reports like to come out, the interim report in the next week or so, and will evidence this even more acutely. These cases illustrate that we haven't been as robust and determined about maintaining the highest of standards that we ought to have been. So I need to go after the integrity of the organisation, those who corrupt it through whatever behaviour that is, and such as the examples I've given. So we've already launched a new command. We've enhanced our sort of counter-corruption capabilities, and what I'm trying to do is to take the language of corruption that we've used historically for the small number of officers who get involved in dishonesty, perhaps with organised crime, but actually saying we need to take the same approach against those who corrupt our integrity, as I say, through sort of racism, misogyny and the like. That's the approach. We have to be equally ruthless about it. We see it as criminality, as unacceptable. It is not bad behaviour. Bad behaviour is, I know, spilling your wine at a dinner party or something. This is corruption, and this needs treating seriously. And you've seen with the case that broke last week with some retired Met officers, one of whom was a border force official, another sort of gruesome sort of WhatsApp group. The change in approach there, where we made an arrest sort of immediately, and that's indicative of the sort of things that we're going to be doing. So strengthening our foundations. It's annoying to have to put time and effort into that because it ought to be there. But unless I don't do that, then Londoners are always going to say, well, hang on, can we trust you? So we need to be seen to be ruthless there. In terms of the policing of London, though, precise community crime fighting is my second point. So by community crime fighting, I'm trying to capture that spirit of Peel, that policing is best done when we're fighting crime with communities. It's not about imposing solutions, it's about how we work with people, whether that's about violence in communities, whether that's about violence against women and girls. And at its heart is community enabled policing, and our neighbour policing model isn't as strong as it was 10 years ago. There's lots of reasons for that, many of them good, maybe some of them less good. But my ambition is that we've got the biggest force we've ever had. I would like us to get back to the strongest neighbourhood policing that we've ever had. Those local police officers and PCSOs who really know the patch and know communities, that is critical to how we operate in the future. It's not the only part of community crime fighting, because everyone should be looking to work with communities, but that is absolutely essential. And that goes to the number of resources, it goes to how they're deployed, it goes to making sure that abstractions aren't too high, which is not the case at the moment. So it goes to many of those issues. My third point then is about the sort of day-to-day service, and some of these I think come out in the HMIC report, and we'll be talking about them later, so I won't spend too much time on that now, but it's pretty obvious there's some reliability issues in our service, response to incidents, calls, crimes, and we'll be talking about those. So trying to stabilise that. To be effective, when you've got sort of millions of calls a year to deal with, to be effective, there's a lot of, some of it's leadership, there's a lot of sort of systems required here. One of the things I've seen in my 4 years sort of working in the private sector and with charities and elsewhere is how the best organisations use technology and data to best effect to understand what works. We are at risk of delivering something that looks a bit more like Woolworths policing in an Amazon age. It's not that our technology hasn't moved on in 10 or 20 years in policing. It just hasn't moved on at the pace the rest of the world has moved. So it doesn't matter if you're improving, if the rest of the world is moving faster, the gap will still widen. And so technology and data is really important. A big part of that is understanding what works, because whatever happens, we're going to need to prioritise our effort. If the mayor was to find a lot of money down the back of the sofa and we were to double the size of the Met overnight, and I could recruit that many people overnight, we would still have to prioritise what we do in terms of the demand for our services. So regardless of the size of the organisation, being really clever about what works, what's going to have the biggest effect on the trust of communities, what's going to have the biggest effect on crime is important. And you can't do that with the data and insight, and ours isn't good enough. So that day-to-day service links into that idea, my sort of my last idea, and sort of part of the strategy, which is about how technology helps us deliver. So those are the themes across sort of integrity, sort of precise community crime fighting, getting the basics right, and technology. The fifth and final one, which I forgot to mention, just as I need to be ruthless about taking on the officers who are letting us down, I've got to be equally vigorous in setting the good majority up to succeed. Because what our colleagues do is just extraordinary, and they come in and day out, regardless of what's in the media and what people say about the organisation, and they do absolutely fantastic things. It really it's been a sort of interesting first 4 weeks. And the incident where a couple of young officers taking on a dangerous man in Westminster, away from the footprints of the funeral, but at the same time, it wasn't linked to it. And they both end up seriously injured from stab wounds. And frankly, one of them would have died if we didn't have an armed response vehicle nearby. Because of their advanced first aid skills, they saved his life. And so you meet those officers in hospital and they're in the 20s, and it's extraordinary what people like that do. But there's a degree of disillusion and frustration in our front line, and you speak to local officers and you see that, because they don't always feel set up in terms of equipment, systems, and they will take on anything for us. They're extraordinary, but they they need that they expect the best support from behind them, and they don't always see that. And I want to improve that in many respects. And sort of one example that you've seen reporting papers is about just everyone having a phone. I mean, sort of it's a fairly obvious thing. And then we have rolled out more technology and tablets over the last under the last commissionership, which is great. But phones has to be a part of the way they operate. Otherwise, they're using their own phones for work purposes, which is not a good idea for all sorts of things. But that's cops being practical, making things work. We need to give them the right technology. There are other issues. There's one reported, for example, in the Daniel Morgan review report about our property store system not standing scrutiny. So that presents in one way in terms of the risk to cases and integrity. But if you're an officer and you're doing a case and just managing the exhibits is 10 times harder than it needs to be, that just gets in the way of you doing your job when you're trying to deal with a case. So there are lots of little examples like that we're going to need to sort of work through. So that's the frame of issues. This all adds together to we're a great organisation with amazing people, but real excellence starts with candour. And I'm really clear that we've let two groups of people down. We've let the public of London down, and they've told us that through surveys and through feedbacks and through politicians. And we've let that good majority on the front line down. And we need to do better for both of them. And part of that's about how the organisations run, and part of that is about getting rid of those people who both sets of individuals are angry about, other people who are undermining our integrity. So those are my thoughts as I start, and that's the context for the 100-day plan and starting to make impact and build a new leadership team that can really sort these issues out for London. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the committee, I would like to say congratulations on the way the policing of our dear late Queen's funeral was handled. I think that was absolutely incredible, and we thank you for that. One of the things that is very topical at the moment, and I have got to ask you about it, are the way that our police officers deal with the Stop Oil protesters. Recently, we see that there are emergency vehicles can't get through. They're just sat there. Members of the public are taking it in their own hands to try and drag them off the streets, which could be dangerous for everybody concerned. But I quite frankly don't blame them. I think I'd be tempted to remove them. And even stories of police officers giving these people sat in the middle of the road cups of tea. Now, I personally think that's appalling. I know a lot of Londoners think it's appalling. Can you tell us the thought behind that and why we are not going to remove them from the streets where they're obstructing immediately?
Yeah, I haven't seen the cups of tea point, and I hope we haven't been doing that because I don't think we should be. I agree with you. That's not our responsibility. This has been a really difficult operation over the 11 days so far, and frankly, it annoys me how much it's taking away from policing local communities. In 11 days, we have put 2,156 officer days into doing this. So that's a sort of couple of hundred per day, roughly. That's an enormous amount of policing resources that aren't tackling issues that matter to local communities, aren't dealing with knife crime, aren't dealing with violence against women and girls. We've made 338 arrests. The majority are just Stop Oil and a handful are animal rebellion. And that's the scale of the operation. I'm frustrated that we haven't done better for London, but the team are working incredibly hard at this. There's a critical legal threshold, and of course Parliament decides what's the balance between lawful protest and sort of unreasonable impact on society. And there are various legal criteria for our intervention. Some of them are about fear of violence and things which don't apply in this sort of situation. The critical one in this context is the concept of serious disruption to the life of the community, I think is the phrase in the law. And so to assess whether these protests are causing that serious disruption, and I know there's lots of sort of media and commentary which suggests there might be, multiple times a day we're taking a view from TfL, relevant local councils, so in most cases on this one I imagine Westminster, and other partners like emergency services, to look at are these protests, are they currently or are they heading towards causing serious disruption to life of the community? And over the last 11 days, all of those partners have been of view that it doesn't cause serious disruption. Now, I know there'll be people here who have a different view, but in terms of...
I'm one.
Yeah. Oh, exactly, yeah, and I can understand that. But if my officers are to make legal intervention, they need to stand it on some evidence that is reasonable. And frustratingly, that's the situation we're in. And that's not a criticism of those partners' views. They've got those perspectives as council and as transport officials. But that's what we're looking to stand on. As soon as they feel, or if it was hitting a business district, if the businesses feel, as soon as we have evidence of that serious disruption either being crossed as a line or a good prospect of it being crossed, then we'll start to be more assertive with our powers.
But surely gridlocks of the road where emergency vehicles can't get through, that is disruption, and that is disruption of the worst kind. If somebody can't get to a hospital in an ambulance, if a fire engine can't get through to a fire, surely that's disruption. What happens if one of your vehicles needs to get to a police officer who's in serious trouble and you need to get people to assist him? What happens then? Would you regard it then as blocking the roads as a hindrance or going over that level that you have to? Because most of the public, it's bad enough they can't get to work. It is shocking when people can't get emergency vehicles to where they need to be. And that's what happens when you gridlock the road system.
I agree with a lot of your sentiment, but the scale of gridlock created depending on the road that's blocked, the law is very clear that just blocking a road in itself isn't automatically serious disruption. And whilst it's committing some offences in terms of obstruction of the highway, those aren't prosecutable if it's a lawful protest, as long as it doesn't exceed reasonable bounds. And that's the judgments police officers have to make the whole time. And as I said at the start, the fact that I've been sort of putting 200 officers a day into policing this, I don't welcome that. That's not good for London's communities, frankly.
No, it isn't.
But I have to work within the legal framework, and I would love to be able to close these down more quickly and spend less policing resources on it at the moment. And I say, as soon as the partners who have the expertise to assess the impact on the road network and the emergency services, as soon as they say this is heading towards crossing the line, we'll be in there straight away. But until that point, I don't have a legal power to do that, and
Okay.
I can't criticise my officers for not doing it.
So TfL is, if we have a word with the Mayor then, because he is the chairman of TfL, and try and get it moved in a different way. I understand your problem. I also understand that lots of Londoners are sick to death.
I can see that in the papers. And so, but I'm not criticising TfL. They have a lot of data.
Neither am I. I'm
machinery.
saying let's look at a broader way that we can get the police some assistance so that you can go in and remove these people. Because when emergency vehicles can't get through, something's got to be done. So if you're saying that TfL, etc., you're talking to them, we'll bring it up with the Mayor because he is their chairman, and I understand your issues. I know other colleagues will want to ask about this, but I'm going to go through my list and they might come back to this.
Of course.
So the next person asking questions is Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Commissioner, firstly, welcome, and can I wish you well as you start tackling the many problems that the Met faces. Commissioner, I actually I've noted your 5 strengths and what you said: more trust, less crime, high standards. Couldn't agree more.
Thank you.
You've given us an indication of how you are intending to go forward. But I want to look at the big picture, Commissioner. I mean, there are many issues, scandals, whatever you do, whatever phrase you use. The Sarah Everard murder, the Daniel Morgan sort of inquiry. But I want to look at the issue of trust and confidence. So if you can put some flesh on what you already told us in your opening statement, what will you do differently to the previous commissioner or commissioners to rebuild trust and confidence in the Met? So whilst the scandals that have rocked the police service for the past couple of years have clearly had a huge impact on trust and confidence, what is potentially underappreciated is the impact that a failure in day-to-day policing has had on communities in London. How are you going to ensure that the more direct link between the police and the communities that you police, how will you go about doing this, and how will you lead a renewal of policing by consent, like you've stated?
Thank you very much. So I agree with the sort of sentiment of your question. Those tackling the issues behind those sorts of scandals and being seen to be determinedly sort of confronting integrity issues in the organisation, so those sort of issues of racism, misogyny, which undermine our service to the public and undermine how our officers inside the organisation feel if they have a bad experience, if they're say black or female. Those are all serious issues, and I think that's part of it, because people need to be sure that we are fair and straight, and that's part of that. But as you say, there's wider issues, and that's why I highlighted that sort of 4-year decline in the confidence of local communities. So there's the multiple layers in this. So at the heart of the confidence and trust of the public is that relationship point I made earlier on, and that's why I want to strengthen community policing. We have a current offer in terms of neighbourhood policing. We have an offer of sort of where we talk about two constables and 1 PCSO per ward as a minimum, and then there's some additional in different places, and we have the town centre teams that were rolled out in sort of some more intense areas requiring more policing, and that's all good. And I've been on patrol in Croydon with some of those officers, and I've got more such things planned, and they're doing good, sensible things. We are a couple of observations. The pressures in the organisation at the moment, which come through large recruiting, how we manage things, a whole load of factors, means that those officers, and you will pick this up in your own wards, I'm sure, are often abstracted. So not only do we have sort of fewer people there than we had sort of maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but our abstraction rates are much higher. Then that's a challenge. So getting that stabilised is important, and I want us to look at whether we can start to rebuild the number of PCSOs as part of that model as well, which we had in the past, because I think we've all seen what a difference they make. So some of it's about that local offer and about how they engage with communities and working with volunteers and all the things that we're familiar with. But then, as I said also, there's that getting the basics of service right, and you've hinted at that yourself. So you'll have heard me talk about, for example, going to every burglary now of someone's home. A burglary of your home is very intrusive, and that's a sort of, I think, quite a powerful sign of the quality of policing response. It's not, what I've said is not a new policy. There has been a policy for some time that we will go to every burglary, but the reality is we haven't been delivering on that. So the reality of the public see hasn't been that, and so we're sort of rapidly escalating the proportion of those we go to, and within not many weeks, I'm confident we'll be up at 100%. And sort of I've seen some recent dip sampling which says yes, we might be getting there already. So moving towards that is important. So thinking about that, and then there's other initiatives on things we're working on at the moment. So improving the feedback to victims of crime, so keeping more in touch with them in a way that we haven't done. So there's many elements to this basic service standard. I think if you look at the HMIC Engage letter, and most of you will have read that, and I think the bullet points A to N in that letter, many of them I think are symptoms in terms of the basic quality of service delivery. Some of what I need to do is to sort of tackle those one by one, but some of them is looking at the causes behind it, which is, say, about resourcing and performance management and leadership and a whole range of other issues as well. So to get improvement in a big complex organisation, there's never one simple lever, but it's that sort of combination of factors. But what the public should see is us stabilising our neighbourhood policing so people are less abstracted, and then hopefully in due course starting to make it stronger across London. They should see other resources more engaged with communities and starting to work differently. And when they call for service and help, that service becoming more stable and reliable. And so we try and strengthen our control centre at the moment with more resources because they're struggling with some of the demand issues as well.
I was actually going to commend you about what you, and indeed the Police Chiefs Council, have said about ensuring that a police officer will go to every burglary. But so in this context, can I also have your commitment that you will ensure that the police service will also record and respond to ASP, antisocial behaviour, more robustly under your leadership?
Antisocial behaviour is really important. I think
that's the day-to-day concern of London.
Antisocial behaviour is really important, and that's part of the reason for having strong neighbourhood policing. I think that neighbourhood policing isn't just about officers, about what you do. And the issue is, do we understand the biggest issues? So let's say the ward where you live. Do we understand the biggest issues concerning the community there around crime and disorder? And are we focusing our effort on those? That's the critical issue. And that understanding requires a lot of engagement and working with communities. Sometimes the solutions are police alone, sometimes it's with local authorities and other partners, sometimes the community themselves can help in fix it. And it's that cycle. And often on top of that list will often be issues of antisocial behaviour. And one way we're trying to improve that, there's a very sort of agile, rapid data collection survey tool that's used by several big American cities that we're sort of starting to test in London to get more rapid understanding of what's worrying particular communities. So,
I mean, the many institutional failures have exposed some of the problems that the Met faces. Sarah Everard, the Stephen Port murder investigations, and I'm seeing the Sisters of Jack Taylor tonight, and I'm sure that they'll be very appreciative of the comments that you made to tackle this institutional failings. But again, going back to, say, let's talk about burglary. The HMI has said that it is concerned that too often there's a failure to get the basics of investigation and prevention right. Do you agree, and what steps will you take to address this?
So we have a sort of, improvement plan for burglary that's picking up those sorts of issues. I mean, for me, it starts with how you turn up. It starts with the basics of investigation in terms of the scene management, looking to see whether is it worth a forensic officer being there, or are there opportunities, sort of knocking house to house, looking for whether there's any CCTV covering the area, all the things you would expect. It's about trying to do those things more reliably and more frequently, and the sort of HMI are right to sort of raise that prospect with us.
And Commissioner, just turning to the issue of resources, do you expect to be able to fulfill the Home Secretary's request that the Met recruits all 4,557 additional officers allocated to it by the end of March 2023?
I'm doing a review on that at the moment and looking at A, can we recruit that many, and B, can we do it with the quality and with the quality that's required, and bring them into the organisation in a way that doesn't destabilise them. I think there's multiple factors there. Just recruiting headlong without making sure you bring the right people in, giving them the best start, the best training, and an organisation that's able to support them and deploy them properly. All of those issues are important, and I'm concerned about whether it's possible or wise to go at exactly that speed, and that's why I'm reviewing it.
Okay. And my final question, Chair, Commissioner, you quite rightly sort of applauded the work done by the overwhelming majority of police officers, decent, hard-working people. Yeah. I think we would all agree with that. Yeah. And the welfare of police officers is very, very important to us. It is part of our scrutiny work. We rightly take our job to scrutinize the police service seriously, but we perhaps don't show appreciation to officers and staff as much as we should. So my admiration for the police service is why I was so concerned recently when I received data in response to a question to the Mayor that 370,000 working days have been lost by the police service due to mental health over the past 4 years. This includes an increase of around 30% this year as compared to last year. And I think the Evening Standard covered this story yesterday. How are you working to improve police officer and police staff welfare?
So I absolutely agree with you, importance of that. And just before I answer the question, just an appeal to Assembly members. You are properly challenging us because of all the challenges we've got, and I have no problem at all with that, and that's your job, and I welcome that scrutiny. It means a lot to our good majority if you keep calling them out, so that sort of to remind the public that whilst as an organisation there's things that we need to do better, we have a great body of men and women, and if you can call that out as often as possible, that's really very helpful, and I appreciate your comments. In terms of officer welfare, there have been some improvements that are just landing at the moment in terms of, I know, feeding facilities at police stations we're just improving, and welfare issues, but I am concerned that we can do more. A couple of examples of that: there's a scheme to build in a sort of quite a clever model for peer debriefing after stressful and intense incidents that can affect officers, and that's a very good scheme. It's been tested nationally. I'm sort of well aware of it. The rollout timescale for that, for me, feels too long, and I've asked them to look at whether they can do that more quickly, for example. And I lose track of the days at the moment. In 5 weeks, it's been quite intense. And yesterday or the day before, I was chatting to a group of officers involved in the public protection area, so dealing with rape and child abuse type cases, it's a different sort of pressure. It's not a danger, gruesome incident stress. But you're spending day in and day out hearing stories and talking to people who are suffering some of the most sort of gruesome and invasive crimes that, frankly, probably for most of us are hard to imagine. And I was asking them about what support they get. So we had a chat about operations and what works and what doesn't, and I asked them at the end of that conversation, sort of last question, how well do we support you? Is there anything we can do better? And they talked through what we do at the moment in terms of what counselling and welfare is available, but they had some observations on how that could be improved, and I intend to take that forward. So I think we need to constantly look at that and recognise we put a big burden on people who are dealing with, whether it's the physically dangerous or the sort of psychologically sort of emotionally damaging, and trying to make sure I wrap as much around them as possible is really important.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We're going now to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome both to the Deputy Mayor and to the Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
So I'd like to start just by thanking you for your measured response on the protest question. The ability to protest in a democracy is a much appreciated freedom in our city and in the country, and it is really important that the police protest fairly and without fear or favour. So thank you for your words on that. I want to pick up on policing by consent, and you were talking about sort of the importance of policing with communities, going back to those Peel principles of policing. The police are the public and the public are the police. And I just wanted to ask a bit more about how you talked about the sort of, we're in a different kind of world, we've got an online world, and how you see we can renew that policing by consent with Londoners when we're in a situation where so many Londoners have experienced such disproportionality in policing that levels of trust are, as you said earlier, very, very low. And I wondered, do you have plans for a sort of big conversation with Londoners? How are you going to take that forward?
So, if you don't mind me saying, I think the big conversation idea is more a political statement than a sort of something I would do. But I am going out meeting lots of people, and some of the things I said about community policing and how we work with people is illustrative. Just to give you one example, I was in Croydon, sort of community centre there a couple of weeks ago, with a really interesting group of people who really care about policing of their area. And of course, Croydon has, over the last 2 or 3 years, has suffered a disproportionate number of murders of sort of young men. I think sort of almost entirely, if not entirely, sort of young black men in the community there. And most of the community sort of leaders I was speaking to there were from the black community. There were faith leaders, there were really impressive young men who were working on sort of community initiatives. There were parents there who'd lost a son. There were some school children, and the sort of emotion, anger, trauma in the room is really palpable. And there's that phrase which is in some of the sort of the national work that policing's doing, and thinking again about issues of race and how we do better on it, about black communities feeling over-policed and under-protected. I think it captures it well, but it's a bit of an antiseptic phrase. But when you're in the room with a group of people like that, it really comes across, because you get both the, look, we're upset and worried, and we've got too many young men dying. I mean, they've had good success recently with the community partnership, where over the last, I think, 8 or 9 months, they haven't had a murder, but they're very worried about it. So there's a real enthusiasm for working more closely with the police and helping us do things differently, and that partnership. So there's an appetite. On the one hand, there's the appetite to do more and a real sort of keenness for that relationship. But on the other side, there's a anger that the way we operate, they don't think's right all the time, and they worry about the way we deploy certain tactics, like stop and search, and whether that has the right effect on the community. So there's both that anger with what we do and that enthusiasm for more. The only way we fix that is by working with groups like that and the sort of very impressive people in the room. And
do you think that...
And you can't, sorry, I was going to say the last thing, you can't... I need to create the ways of working and the framework that we're working differently. You can't impose the solutions to that from Scotland Yard. It's about sort of creating an approach which is locally led and created.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, though, that there are lessons to be learned from places like Thames Valley Police, who have done a lot of work with diversion as opposed to criminalisation, for instance, for possession of cannabis? So they've done, I think there's sort of 7 years of evidence of those kind of divert programmes, which mean that people who are arrested at the moment and put into the criminal justice system and then have a criminal record actually don't get arrested and are put into sort of community-led programmes to divert them from criminality or anything that might lead into criminality. And is that approach something that you would be interested in?
So when I was sort of, seems a lifetime ago now, but when I was Chief Constable of Surrey, which is sort of, I left there in 2011, so I suppose it is a lifetime ago. One of the things I did in my time as Chief Constable there was one of the driving forces nationally in sort of building a different approach to out-of-court disposals. Then we created something which eventually became community resolutions. And this isn't about being sentimental or soft. This is about evidence. And the evidence is that on certain types of crime, where you've got the right conditions in terms of the nature of the victim and the offender, that diversion generates higher victim satisfaction and lower recidivism. Frankly, sort of if you've got both of those things, why wouldn't you do it? Those seem to be the two ultimate tests. If you only had one of them, maybe you might be questionable about it. But if you've got high victim satisfaction and low recidivism, then it seems to me a bit of a no-brainer. That sort of thinking's developed over time. There've been quite a few national sort of evaluations. The Thames Valley work I'm a bit aware of. The Met's done a piece of work which I
think in Lewisham there was a trial announced,
but was it called Turning Point? So I can't remember what it's called anyway. But so and there's a new framework in legislation for out-of-court disposals, which is sort of supposed to be implemented in sort of 1st of April, which I'm keen on. And I think we in the Met have been less ambitious in out-of-court disposals than many other places. I think another dimension to this, the Lammy review looked at these issues, and I can't remember how long David Lammy's review was. It's probably 5 years ago now, maybe more than that. But he pointed out, as part of his look at sort of race disparity and justice, I think was the broad sort of sweep of what he was looking at, that in terms of out-of-court disposals, not only does the evidence base show that generally, say, high victim satisfaction, low recidivism, but the benefits with non-white offenders were even higher. So it's a good thing to do anyway, and in a sort of diverse, complex society, it's an even better thing to do. So I'm very enthusiastic about it.
Well, I'm very glad that you're enthusiastic about it, because I do think it would be something that could really help in terms of reducing the breakdown in trust and confidence, and it could really help us.
I'm grateful for support. The other point I'd make on the back of it is, in the context where the criminal justice system has growing backlogs, not putting things into it that don't need to be in it sort of also makes sense.
Indeed, yes, a practical thing. I just have one tiny extra question, Chair, which is just on the, sort of, you've been talking a lot about technology and data, and I'm just wanting to check that you've got checks in place about disproportionality, because once you start using tech and data for decision making, and the worry is that you have inbuilt disproportionality just in the algorithms within the tech, and
of course,
and is that something that you're on
you
top
have to be,
of?
So 2 points to make. One, yes, of course, be very, very careful what you feed into the machine and what you're using, so you don't accidentally create sort of unethical approaches. But secondly, this is not about computers or algorithms making decisions. Just to be, I must be completely sort of absolute on that. This is about using technology to help cops and staff make better decisions. I think that's the important distinction here. So I don't want any sort of sense of, particularly for any of the media watching this, is no sense of a sort of a minority report approach to policing. It's quite the opposite. It's simply, we want our police and staff to make great decisions, and to do that, just like in any organisation, let's give them the technology and the data and the insights to help them do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you. Welcome, Sir Mark. It's good to see you back before us again. I want to pick up two things. One, you started to mention a bit in your opening words, which were very interesting, around counter-corruption, because the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel report is a really uncomfortable read.
Yes.
And the HMI inspection on counter-corruption raised a number of things: administrative practices and record-keeping woeful. These all indicate an organisation not taking the risks of corruption anywhere near seriously enough. The inspector concludes its apparent tolerance of the shortcomings we describe in this report suggests a degree of indifference to the risk of corruption. In really strong words. What are you going to do that's different? Because it took 9 months for the Met to respond to the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel. I felt they were just saying this is an issue from the 80s. They were not understanding some of these issues are live now. So what are you going to do that's different, that's going to assure us?
So I think there's, it's a little while since I read the Morgan report, Daniel Morgan HMIC report, but and there's a couple of different things here. One, I think some of the things were about recommendations in terms of systems and preventative issues, like the one I mentioned earlier in terms of property stores. And what they were saying was, if you don't have your basic systems in place, it creates potential vulnerabilities. And my point earlier about sort of data and performance management and assurance and all of those issues goes to just having those basics right that make those things harder to deal with. In terms of dealing with the sort of wider corruption issues, so we've historically seen corruption as about dishonesty, officers having corrupt relationships with criminals or whatever else. We haven't applied the same tactics and thinking to officers who abuse their position in other ways and sort of misogyny, sexual misconduct, etc., racism, homophobia, etc. And that's the change I'm making. The HMIC report is very complimentary about our dedicated counter-corruption capability in our professional standards unit. But it's a small unit designed for that historic problem. And so what I'm doing is making it much bigger, adding some different tactics and technologies into it, changing the resourcing, giving it some sort of fresh and more senior leadership as a way of supercharging it, so I can turn it away from not just dealing with sort of those other old problems, which they're not what they were, but then they'll never go away completely, but focusing it on sort of say those more contemporary issues, and being absolutely ruthless about the standards we set in the organisation being clear to people. And I think if I look at sort of some of the stuff that Louise Case is turning up, and this will become clear when her report comes out soon, an inconsistency in setting standards and just some lack of confidence sometimes from leaders in terms of where to draw a line in terms of behaviour. So that's just not appropriate in a modern organisation. So there's everything about leadership development and basic standards through the organisation, through to the more acute effort with a much bigger team of dedicated resources, going after and identifying proactively the problem individuals. This plays into vetting and how we do that work, and that was commented on in that report. So there's multiple strands to it, but it's basically about confronting something that I think we've undercooked, and sort of there have been previously more resources put into it, but I think there's a much wider systematic approach needed to change the way we do it. And I was chatting to a focus group of officers yesterday, and there's a real appetite for clearer standards and stronger approaches. And I've heard too many stories from black colleagues and women colleagues who've had unpleasant experiences in the organisation which have been dealt with too feebly.
But you're accepting, which is refreshing, quite frankly, that this is not just a historic event, and the report's looking at it, that these are issues live and now, and that you've got to put in a huge range of changes.
Completely. And so I think the bit that's depends on where you describe corruption. If you sort of policing and relationships with organised crime, and sort of you had the burst of effort to try and that Sir Robert Mark did in the 1970s, where CRD was out of control. You then had the CIB3 initiative at the early part of this century, led by sort of Paul Condon and John Stevens as commissioners, which is about some corrupt squads. And those issues are almost gone. We'll always have individual officers go rogue in that way, but that we've much got better controls there. But what I'm saying is we need to see corruption as things that corrupt our integrity, which capture the sort of things we're talking about, and the sort of approaches which helped us defeat those problems and get them down to a sort of almost irreducible minimum. We need to be applying to these issues of standards, because we can't say, as I've heard once or twice, well, of course, we reflect the challenges in society. That's not acceptable. We enforce the law. We have unique powers as given to us by Parliament in terms of enforcing the law and trying to maintain a safe society. And you can't have the trust of citizens if you're not aiming for the highest of standards in terms of your own integrity. So we have to be above the average. We can't be of the average. And that's always going to be a challenge to achieve, but that's what we have to do.
Yeah. And I've got one final very quick question on something different. Your appointment as the Commissioner, you're appointed by the Monarch on the recommendation of the Home Secretary. Can you confirm to us if your terms of appointment have been established and set by the Home Secretary or by the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime?
There's a complicated question. So the final so the process is, as you say, the process is the Home Secretary makes the decision in consultation with the Mayor. I had a very interesting selection process. I had a sort of an officer-led panel, and then in a week I managed to have 3 political interviews in 3 days with the Policing Minister, the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, and then the Home Secretary, which was an unusual week. The final sort of details in terms of terms and conditions is then a sort of process with City Hall. So that's how that was done.
So what the documentation that you have signed and any contract, if you like,
was a correspondence exchange between myself and Diana Luxford was how it was agreed.
Right. Okay. Lovely. That's
it's not. So I hesitate. It's not a contract. So I'm not. I'm not an employee.
No, that's not clear.
I'm a sort of independent, sort of Crown appointed office holder, and I mean the legal status is I've got a sort of I'm an independent corporation sole, which is a most bizarre way of it's a bizarre description, isn't it? But there you go. And so there's that balance to be struck, and Sir Tom Windsor said in his report that it hadn't been done properly previously, and Diana was enthusiastic about changing that and getting it right this time, to try and capture that balance between, there's obviously some pay and rations things that need sort of agreeing, so to speak, but capturing that balance between, I've been appointed on the back of a process to do some things for London, and it's perfectly proper, that's in some way reflected, but likewise the contract doesn't sort of change the legal status of those different responsibilities of a police and crime commissioner, a home secretary and a commissioner, and that's what we worked through, and I think we came to a sensible arrangement.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
I wasn't
that.
expecting a question on that, I have to say.
Oh, never expect things for us. We come up with all sorts. Colleagues, you know how I nag about the time. I'm nagging now, so can we keep the next questions as short as possible, please? Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner. You said all the right things over the last 5 weeks. We've been watching you closely, but it's all about delivery, isn't it?
Absolutely.
How quickly are you going to be able to drive change? Let me give you one specific example. The Jewish News last week, Met Police drop investigation into Oxford Street Hanukkah bus attack. A lot of people are very upset about that. What are you going to do about driving change, and what are you going to do about reassuring the Jewish community about anti-Semitism, please?
So anti-Semitism is unacceptable, and that reporting is inaccurate, as I understand it. We have some images on that case, and we're still trying to identify the people who were guilty of that. In terms of speed of progress, we will go as fast as possible to make the changes necessary. So, I will be happy to update this committee and indeed publicly on the progress we make in my first 100 days in terms of starting the journey of reform that the Metropolitan Police requires, and I'll be relentless about that. I'm not going to pluck random numbers or dates out of the air, but we will go as fast as possible, and you should challenge me on whether I'm doing that.
I'll leave it there because the Chair has given me a deep look, but I look forward to having a far more detailed discussion with you on anti-Semitism over the months.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. I'll give a deep look also to Assembly Member Ahmed, if you can keep it brief, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Commissioner, on the 22nd of June, we were speaking to the Metropolitan Police Federation and asking questions, and I asked a question in this committee quoting the IOPC report into Operation Hutton, and specifically, as you know, that report predominantly looked at the issues in Charing Cross, particularly the appalling WhatsApp messages that were sent by officers there. And I quoted the line from the report: "We believe these incidents are not isolated or simply the behaviour of a few bad apples." I asked the chair of the Metropolitan Police Federation to comment, and his response was to basically say that it was the fault of mobile phones and that younger officers had access to mobile phones and these messages were going on mobile phones. Could you comment on that and let us know what you think about that comment?
Without seeing the whole conversation, I think it's hard for me to comment on it. I mean, I have had meetings with Ken Marsh, Chair of the Federation, over the last couple of weeks, and he has assured me of his complete support for getting rid of officers who don't meet the standards that we all expect. And I know he feels strongly about that. I can't sort of comment on the conversation you had. I think the overall issue is, I would say this isn't just about young officers, just to clarify it. So I think it's noteworthy that the case that broke last week, the group of retired Metropolitan Police officers, including a Border Force official, where we made that arrest last Thursday, they're all retired officers, so they're not at the they're more at I know, towards my age than they are in their 20s, and so I think it spreads across all different ages, because then everyone uses the technology. I think the tricky issue here to try and I don't think we can put a scale to it exactly, but it's more than bad apples, but it's not pervasive. The reason I say it's not pervasive, I sit down with officers, some men, women, black, white, etc., And some of them say, I've seen awful stuff and it's been badly dealt with. Some of them say, I've never seen awful stuff. I don't like all this talk about it. This is not the organisation I've been in. I've had a fantastic time. And I've never seen sort of prejudice or never suffered it. And so what I take from that is, and one of the officers I was talking to yesterday said his view is that the Met we have micro cultures. So depending on a local team, local leadership, local characters, teams can be fantastic and all the standards we'd expect, but a number of those teams aren't. And that's what we've got to get better at, finding those teams that have gone wrong, those leaders that aren't setting the right standards, and tackling those issues.
Thank you, and forgive me for looking at my phone. I wasn't being rude. I was trying to get the exact quote up at the time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to confirm Ken Marsh would absolutely like to get rid of the bad apples as much as anybody else. I've spoken to him at length from that. Neil Garrett, please, next Assembly Member.
Good morning. So when I thought about what the Met's priorities should be, I came up with 4, and the first 3 were dealing. I like the fact you're getting your pen out, which is very promising. So the first 3 we've heard about already this morning, about improving public confidence, because nothing can be done really without that. Second one, dealing with bad officers, which I'm very pleased with your response on. And the third is violent crime, whether street crime or against women and girls or domestic violence. Those are all, I'm really reassured by what you've said on that. The fourth is volume crime, which we've heard a bit about. My concern with volume crime, it's natural that it has less of a priority than violent crime, but my concern is that it contributes to this sort of pervasive sense of lawlessness, which again feeds into public confidence. And I'm particularly thinking of things like technology-enabled fraud. We've heard a bit about burglary. I think your response there was good. But I wonder where in your priorities you think about that, because it seems to be an enormous and growing level of crime, which is sort of slightly invisible and creates difficult jurisdictional problems, but can have devastating impacts on people, which I'm sure you've heard many tales of.
No, I think your point on fraud is spot on. We all get irritating texts and emails, most of which are obviously dodgy, but we can all get caught out on occasion, and I imagine some people in this room have probably been caught out because it's very hard not to be. And probably we all know people who've had sort of traumatic incidents where they've lost significant amount of money or had stress on their lives. So, and it's the number keeps changing, but I think it's not far off half of crime, sort of in terms of what's out there. The police have at most crime, the police aren't the whole solution, and in this case, that's definitely the case. A lot of it sits with finance institutions and sort of how good the systems are in that way, and with some national agencies work and action fraud, etc., sort of run by the Home Office and City of London, which they're procuring a better solution because we all know that that's had some problems. But all that said, local police forces, including the Met, so as the biggest local police force, so to speak, having a credible response to it and a credible sort of approach to it, I think is important. I don't think we're there yet. My view on it is that we've got, I think I can't remember the exact numbers. Sort of, it's a small number of hundreds of officers involved with fraud and economic crime, etc. And the challenge I've given to the team is I want us to spend the next sort of year experimenting with some different ways of operating to try and work out what works better, because there is an argument, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years whether policing needs to put more resources into tackling fraud, and I sort of and that may be part of the right approach nationally. But to start off with, you're going to put more money into something, because if you say to me, I'll double your money on fraud, actually at the moment I'm not sure I'd take it. That might sound odd, because I'm not sure the work we're doing is the best way of spending it. So I want to try and find different ways of operating, and as part of my 100-day plan, we've got some big operations planned where we're working in different ways to try and more get to the source of fraud rather than just pick up the referrals at the end of the chain. So we've got some different tactics, and I'm not going to speak anything more than sort of around it at the moment, but you'll see that developing. I don't mind briefing you in private on it at some point. So I do see it as an issue. I want us to get clever about how we do it, and I was only discussing yesterday with the Director General of the National Crime Agency how with his national leadership role, how I can sort of weigh in alongside him and help us think about how we do this differently at a national level because of the points you make jurisdictionally. And I think if sort of the scale of the Met means that sort of if we start to work differently and find a different way of working with the National Crime Agency on it, that can help set the tone nationally. The Met isn't the answer to all things. I've spent most of my policing career in other forces, but sometimes sort of scale helps, and so on this area, I think we can help make a difference.
I quite like the sound of that, cautiously, because I think the sense that I get is that it sort of falls on the City of London Police, who are very small and can't deal with it because it's enormous, and then you have this multi-agency problem where, as you say, you've got the local police force who technically are responsible for the victim, but what do you do if it's someone far away who's the criminal? And so what I would urge, that piece of research that you're doing, that sounds good. I like the fact that you're looking into it, because I think currently the approach isn't working, is to involve not just the City of London Police and local police forces, but also thinking about whether there needs to be legislative change and involving technology companies, telcos, IT companies and so on, who it seems to me have a role both in enabling it and could have a bigger role in preventing it, because it's a volume crime.
That's definitely right. And sort of one of the things I did in my sort of gap 4 years outside policing, I did some work with one of the global professional services firms and developed their strategy on this and chaired their sort of global board on illicit finance. And we were looking at, because they work with both governments across the world and the financial sector, and it's very clear to me that the join up across the two is not enough, and this is a global issue. There's a very powerful article, if you're interested in the subject, in The Economist about a year ago, which basically makes the argument very credibly that the global anti-money laundering regime is the world's least successful ever policy experiment, which is quite a claim actually. But sort of, but if you read it, you may be persuaded. And I think, and a lot of the answer to this is the way the private sector and governments work together differently, sharing data to both help the private sector cut more of it off at the pass, because often we have the insight that can help them make the right interventions. And then they have some of the intelligence and data that can help us be more effective in enforcement. So, and the government's got a new piece of legislation going forward. I can't remember what it's fraud bill or economic crime bill, I can't remember, but they are looking at data sharing powers and other things to try and encourage more data sharing and accelerate that, which I welcome.
Great, thank you very much. I look forward to the briefing that you mentioned. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Sir Mark.
Good to meet you.
I'm really pleased that you've acknowledged that there is a problem with race in the Met and the impacts that you talked about on your staff and officers who are black, and actually the wider cohort of staff. But the issues that the Met has with race will obviously impact quite directly the lives of black Londoners in particular, but also those from other minority ethnic groups. And I just wondered, in this new role, there are many people, many communities out there who would really want to see a step change in the way that the Met engages with the black community in London, and what proactive steps are going to be taken. So obviously there are some interventions, I suppose, outlined in the police and crime plan, and you talked about the fact that even if something is going in a positive direction, if everything else is going faster in a positive direction, the gap is widening. And that is whether real or perceived, that is the perception on the ground of many black Londoners in the way that they're engaged with as perpetrators rather than victims of crime. So just I would welcome, perhaps not fully here, but at a later date, to understand what you intend to do and how you're going to bring about that change across the Met.
Yeah, okay, I'll mention a couple of things now, and I'd be happy to talk about it further and pick your brains as well, because I'm sure you've got some thoughts on it, as well. I go back to that sort of that Croydon conversation where it really brings out that tragically crime doesn't fall evenly across London, does it? And the solution to that has to be the most intense joint working in the places and with the communities who we need to help sort of deal with particular issues, and that sort of conversation illustrates that. We can't step back from issues like violent crime. Everyone wants them tackled, but likewise we can't we can't just impose a solution like a 1950s GP, sort of here's the prescription, take your tablets and don't ask any questions. That doesn't work in the modern world in any sort of context, and it doesn't work in policing. And that's why I'm spending part of my time sort of as I sort of develop my thinking further, speaking to key people in different communities and getting that sense about how we do it differently. Because it's easy to try and set a different tone and think about where you put resources, but then looking at what can I do to change the way the organisation operates? Are there different ways we can use stop and search that still have the same effect on taking weapons off the street but have more supportive communities? Are there other tactics we could use instead of that? Looking for different approaches, and are there ways that we can develop more joint solutions with communities to deal with certain issues? And picking up the point, for example, about diversion from earlier on, sort of the intervention schemes that go on the back of, say, out-of-court disposals, where you get sort of basically, look, we won't prosecute you as long as. Some of those interventions can be done from community groups. I think there's all sorts of, and that's probably got some commissioning consequences, and there's all sorts of different ways to do this, but becoming more joined up, where we don't shy away from facing where there are really acute crime challenges, but we work with communities in terms of how we deal with that. And that's, if it was easy, we'd have done it already, frankly. But that's what we're going to make progress on, and we will make a difference. And I think I've been in policing a long time. That's why I've got no hair. And we've had a lot of action plans on race, and we have made progress. But as you said, we haven't made anywhere near enough. And I'm determined that on my watch we will find some answers to make much bigger progress. I can't claim I'm going to fix it. This is so complicated and so long-standing, but I want to find some really different routes. And I think some of it goes to culture and approaches. It's not just about ticking off actions on an action sheet, and that's what makes it difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very briefly, one of the things that concerns me is that an awful lot of police time is spent doing what the police aren't there for. They're not supposed to be sitting in hospitals for hours waiting for mental health nurses to come and relieve them of the people they're with, for instance. I know this because I've been stuck in a hospital with police who could not go back to their duties because this girl had to be handed over. Has any work been done on the amount of time spent by officers doing things that they're really not there for, and where it could be assisted if other things were put in places by our other partners?
Chair, I couldn't agree more with you. I think one of the challenges that fits into that basket of issues I spoke about earlier about setting officers up to succeed is that sense of a blurred and bureaucratic mission that we've ended up with for them. So they know what they want to be doing and what they think they ought to be doing to protect the public, but we get drawn into other issues that feel more like sometimes social work or health work. And that's not said in any derogatory way whatsoever. That's really important work. It's just not what we're good at. And it's sort of and meanwhile, there's lots that we're not doing that only we can do, and that's the conundrum here. I think it's interesting looking at different approaches across London. So I can't remember which one and the geography. There's one health trust or mental health trust in London where if officers turn up with a mental health detention case, they've absolutely committed to those officers can leave within an hour. So they will put in arrangements and sort of sort it out. So there's one institution in London doing that. There are others where officers are sat there for hours and hours and hours. I was with a team at Croydon, I'm trying to remember. I was with a team in Croydon a couple of weeks ago, the sort of late duty shift, and I was asking them about what gets in the way of you doing your job, and everyone always mentions the mental health issue. It's number one issue. And they said they'd come on duty as sort of a team of officers to sort of, I think, for a late shift, and the first thing they had to do was send 6 double crewed cars to hospital to manage 6 patients, and they spent most of the whole shift there. So this is big numbers of resources and distraction. I've pushing the team to get better data on this. I mean, I've heard different numbers bandied around, 30-40% of police time linked to mental health, and then that number captures everything from crimes committed by all the way through to specific narrow cases like that. But we do have to make a big dent on that, and because it feeds into us drawing us away from policing communities, from tackling violent crime, violence against women and girls. It's all linked to that, and there are, it's not going to be straightforward. And the health service isn't deliberately passing this to policing, but that's the consequence of how they're currently organised and working, and I need to push back against it. And I've been talking to chiefs in other parts of the country, some of whom have got some clever ideas about how they've moved that line.
Good, because it's been going on for a very long time.
I agree.
And certainly when I talk to frontline officers, it's one of their concerns, because they, as you say, they would rather be doing something else. Okay, so we're now moving on to HMI's report, the Peel report. So we'll start with some questions on that. And you'll be relieved to know, Sir Mark, that I'm going to start the questions with Sophie Linden. Sophie, as a key player in overseeing the performance of the Met, what is your response to the concerns raised by the HMI Peel inspection report about how the Met responds to the public and the level of understanding it has about demand?
Thanks a lot. I mean, we've had a long conversation and discussion around this last time we met at the Police and Crime Committee, I think in July, because we'd had the letter, and clearly we've now had the detailed report. I mean, it's, as I think I probably said last time, it is really uncomfortable and challenging reading. Some of the, it requires improvement, and then the bits that are inadequate. I said last time as well that, and I know you challenged me on this, Chair, I would have been really concerned if in that report, the vast majority of what was in that report was new to me and new to MOPAC. It wasn't. We have been, and as I said last time, we've been challenging the Metropolitan Police on a number of those issues, from response to victims, to emergency response, to how in particular there's bits around public protection. We've done a fair amount of oversight around public protection and the public protection plans. We've welcomed the Metropolitan Police being put into Engage, because that Engage process, with that Engage process comes challenge, but it also comes offers of support. And we are working with Sir Mark and his senior leadership team around what are the responses around Engage. But really importantly, and Sir Mark has already touched on this, I am really pleased and optimistic around around change, and that this will be transformative of the Metropolitan Police, because the way in which Sir Mark and his team are talking about is, yes, there are individual things that should be closed, and there are obviously the recommendations in the Peel report for things that have to be done within 6 months and within 9 months, and of course they must be done, and we must make sure they are done. But actually underlying this, there are some really key, it's the causes that Sir Mark talks about, and that is, I am really pleased that that is the way in which his senior leadership team are looking at the Engage process, which is, yes, to close down and sign off and tick off, if you like, individual issues, but to really think what are the structural, systemic issues within this report, really looking at supervision, leadership, training, and also the issues around inexperienced officers. So we're at early stages of the Engage process. And Sir Mark's 100-day plan for the first 100 days is part of that. And I sit on the transformation board as well that Sir Mark has set up in order to be able to transform the Met, as the title says.
Okay, I still remain surprised that you're pleased, but there we go. Commissioner, does the Met fully understand the increasing demand facing the Met CC and how it's planning for this?
Do we fully understand it? We certainly understand the scale of the challenge here. I mean, some of the there's now, I think, sort of last year over 6 million contacts a year, sort of, that we're now facing, and that number's gone up year on year. And you can see the stretch that's creating. We're sustaining our response to immediate calls, so emergencies we're sort of well under the 15-minute target on average. But when you look at more standard grade calls, so non-emergencies or the extended response over the first 24 hours, where it's even that those we're well behind target. So you can see the effect there. There are issues throughout the system with sort of managing the demand, and as I said earlier about having better data and better understanding is part of what I'm trying to achieve, because we don't have good enough analysis, and we're building a sort of our project PL is building a sort of a data centre and really giving us that modern insight. But some of the first steps we're taking, there's work going on to recruit, to fill vacancies and put extra posts into our contact centre, because that's struggling. And we're reviewing the scale of our response teams to make sure they've got the right resources. And that fits also with your last question, Chair, about the right resources, but also are they doing the right things? Which your point about mental health is a good one, a good one on that. So there's a lot to do in that area to stabilise the performance. We also have as you know, a sort of big project to replace our command and control technology. Which our current technology, I think, dates from the 1970s. Which is you pulled a face there, which I agree. I completely agree with that sentiment. It's like sort of, and the challenge replacing a system which has been almost tailored around us like a perfect sort of old piece of clothing that you sort of now fits you so perfectly you don't want to lose it. But of course the technology is way out of date and quite fragile, and this is long overdue. But getting the technology in place is challenging, and I think you'll have seen that project has slipped a couple of times and is due now, I think, to come to fruition in 2024. And whilst it's slipped behind, we're pleased with the sort of efforts the company we're working with are putting into that. And just to make that really practical, our existing software doesn't automatically identify whether someone's called us before. So imagine you're a repeat victim of something. You've got some difficult issue with a dangerous neighbour, or in some sort of really threatening ongoing situation of domestic violence or abuse. Our systems aren't great at spotting that. So basic things that one would expect to find in any modern call centre, operation centre, the technology is stretched and doesn't do all of that. So the sooner we can get better technology in, the better. In the meantime, frankly, people are the answer, because you're using people to prop up a system which is never going to be the most cutting edge. No, it's a shame it keeps slipping. Yes, I agree. What's the vacancy rate at the moment in the command and control? I don't know the vacancy rate, but the numbers I do have, I think we're looking at them. We're growing in there by 80 people. But we need to recruit 200 over the next few months. So I think that 120 difference is probably a mix of current and expected departures. So we are slipping underneath it. Right. Okay. It's an important area, as you well know. So we'll keep an eye on that. I'll move to the next question. It's Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you. I want to pick up the IT issue, which, quite frankly, we've talked about for years, and Craig Mackey every year at Budget Committee would talk about why he'd underspent capital, because everything seems to slip constantly in the public sector. But in the Peel report, it's very clear that you're relying on a planned new IT system for the Met CC in the longer term. But this is scheduled to be implemented after Connect IT programme, which is going to integrate lots of your systems. Yes. Can you talk us through that? And we understand the delays in that Connect IT system as well. So what are the timescales for these, and when are we going to expect to see that step change? Yeah, so Connect is much closer to fruition. So just to canter across it, so Assembly members understand the sort of context of these two. So most forces in the UK have two core systems. We have more than that. There's the one we've just talked about, which is your command and control system. So how you manage calls for service, coming in, recording that, and then dispatching officers. And that, of course, has to connect to other bits of other systems, has to connect to your phone system. That's the command and control system, which is the project which is currently sort of red, but is making good progress to try and get out of red. Connect is much more advanced. So the other core parts of policing, if you think about crime investigation, so intelligence records, prisoners in custody, case preparation for court,
Over the last couple of decades, most forces have gone to solutions where all of those things are on one system, because as you can imagine, the sort of, just think about the criminal, in the middle of that, the criminal will be on the intelligence record, the crime record, the court system and the custody record. So having those on separate systems isn't the most effective. Sort of, we're not as integrated as other forces in that respect, and we're now getting a system that will do that, which is a system that's been used by some other forces in the UK. Something we always face, frankly, in the Met, just the scale of the organisation makes the technology and other challenges bigger than they have been elsewhere, and that always creates challenges. I'm sort of very alive to landing as a commissioner in a few weeks' time, and a big core system is going to be replaced. It's not something that sort of doesn't that sort of I'm ignoring at all, because these things can be very, very challenging. I was very pleased to see that a very well reputed sort of external organisation has done a serious programme review. A company called Newton Europe did this, and I've read that, and that was very positive about the leadership and the progress being made on that project. It's not been without all these big projects got problems, but it's gone well. I haven't seen many reviews as optimistic as that about the sort of as positive as that about the state of a big complex programme. So that's reassuring. And we're now in the final stages. We're busy training people, and the first stage of go live is the 29th of November. We've decided to roll it out in parts rather than do the whole thing. So we're rolling out the custody and some of the other functionality, like to do with case and property. So those two parts of the system first, and then in due course the crime and intelligence and other pieces will be at a later date. I think that's next year. But that's on track, and the training's on track. We've had a couple of final tweaks to the start date, frankly mainly based around disruptions caused by big events like the state funeral, but that's only moved it by a week or two. So it's now due for the go live on the 29th of November. It's challenging, but we are making good progress, and I think from what I've seen on one of these projects, I'd never bet against having a couple more little sort of creases to sort out. But as I say, with the quality, with the sort of depth of the review work that's been done, I think this should land from what I've seen.
So that starts the rollout 29th of November.
Yeah.
When do you expect it to be fully operational?
So those first functions are fully operational on that date.
Yes, but I meant for all the different systems. When do you expect the whole package to be up and running?
This is where you're testing my ability to absorb lots of information in a few weeks. I can't remember. I can't remember the date. I think it's sometime next year. Sophie might be able to recall it. But the other stages of it.
And where is it on the risk register? Because you said that your METCC one is red on the risk register. Do you have a timeline for that? Is that the one that you said is 2024?
Yes, that's what we're aiming at the moment. So the company we're working with, Leidos, have put their top American team on that. The head of the company is personally involved in making sure that work comes out the red. He's had previous meetings with the previous commissioner as part of his commitment, and I'm meeting him in October.
Okay, and then in terms of slippage, sounds like the Connect one is really on course, but the other one, can you assure us there'll be no further slippage?
No.
No, of course not. It's IT, public sector.
Yeah, so we'll do our damnedest to make sure there isn't, but I'm not going to make a promise I can't guarantee.
Yeah, I feel that I have lived Met IT systems the
Tell
whole
me about
time
it.
I have been involved, from the police authority to here. Sophie, you probably feel the same. Are you concerned about Met's reliance to improve performance as a result of IT upgrades? And how are you and the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime keeping an eye on this? Because it's critical to transforming the service.
So yes, of course, like Sir Mark, it is one of those things that's incredibly challenging. We all know the history of large public sector IT. However, I know you know and you've lived this, but 2016, one of the decisions, 2016-17, one of the decisions I had to take was to terminate the contract, or to agree to terminate the contract of the previous command and control system. So the Met had to start afresh and start anew. So whilst it is delayed and it is absolutely crucial, they've done quite, there's been quite at pace some really good work. In terms of what's the role of myself and MOPAC in overseeing and having oversight and scrutiny of this, I would genuinely say this is an area where we have done considerable oversight, and I think the financial oversight and scrutiny that has been, the improvements and development in MOPAC has really improved since 2016 and is still improving, because the team has increased, the expertise has increased, but also one of the things we have done is work very closely with the Metropolitan Police around these two really large IT systems, to work closely with them, not just in our oversight and scrutiny, but really work closely with them in terms of what other independent assurance and other independent gateways are you putting in place. And so Mark has already outlined there's the Newton, and also they've commissioned another independent assurance which will be part of the decision making at the end of October. So there has been really considerable oversight, not only for Command and Control but also for Connect. On Command and Control, because it is so crucial and because it was so risky, I have also met the head of LIDOS before the summer to, if you like, to really make sure that they understood that this isn't a technical issue. This isn't an internal Metropolitan Police issue. This is a real important mayoral priority for Londoners that the Command and Control has delivered. And he really did assure me, and I've been told as well, that he is taking personal interest, and what he has promised is being delivered in terms of capacity, expertise and prioritisation of the Command and Control, and getting that right. And so Mark talked about some of the things that you're tweaking of timing. We mustn't forget also, particularly on Command and Control and also on Connect, that one of the issues that is not the only reason for slippage, I'm not only saying this, but one of the issues for slippage is that during COVID, a lot of the programming was happening in India, and there was real problems around the programming for the systems. But there's also been changes in scope, there's been changes in things that's needed, and things haven't gone the way that they were expected to. But we will continue to have really close eye on this. A member of MOPAC was invited to the management board last week when this was being discussed, in order to be, a part of the discussions and to have that assurance. And I know that will continue.
And will these new systems, going back to your rather fabulous quote at the start, put this at the Woolworths level of digital or the Amazon level?
It's making a step on that journey. We haven't tried to get the most cutting-edge technology, because these are so foundational, and that's not to criticise the companies. They're good technologies in this space. But particularly so you look at the Command and Control system. Part of the Met's criteria at the time in terms of selection, which I fully, I think was wise, was we want systems that are already running in big organisations and running in the UK. So by definition, they're not going to be currently under development if you take that view. I think when you're looking at where we can be cutting edge, so you look at things like developing technologies around digital forensics, etc., or things like that. There are new companies out there all the time developing new tools, and you can test technologies and plug them in, etc. And those parts of what we do, you can do really insightful and clever things. I think your two core platforms on an organisation that's so big, to go for something that's not yet in existence on the basis somebody promises you it might be really great, I think would be very exciting, but not very wise, probably.
No, that's useful. And are we able to see the risk register around these programmes, please?
I don't know what level, 'cause I think some of it's commercially confidential, but I would think some headline levels are certainly possible. But I need to check back, but I think some of the detail underneath it will have comments in there which are quite tricky to put completely publicly for reasons you'd understand.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think something that's tried and tested is perfectly much safer.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Sophie, do you have the figures that Assembly Member Pigeon was asking for when we think that the whole suite will be delivered by?
I don't have that in my briefing, no, sorry. No,
that's fine. Can you write to the committee and let us know? Because it's an interesting question. Thank you very much. We're now going over to Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you very much. So my first question is to the Commissioner, and there's data to suggest that only 40% of repeat victims are recorded and 55% of victims are checked for vulnerability, which is obviously quite low and needs to be improved. So I'm just wondering what action the Met's taking to increase your consistency. You've talked a bit about the IT systems. And how are you going to ensure that they are going to be recorded to improve those numbers, to make sure that we know who people are?
Yes, good question. So, as we've mentioned, the technology route is the obvious route to sort of fix this, but that's not going to happen overnight. So there are various workarounds and changes in process. So we've got a manual process at the moment, which we're sort of using as a sort of decision-making tool at first contact. There's the national model, which we've been rolling out in terms of Thrive, which is an assessment process in terms of prioritising response to calls, threat, harm, risk, intelligence, vulnerability, and engagement. So that getting that model in place for all calls is something we are looking to do, and that then will help us deal with that. And there is some back-end data analysis to try and fix. So if you can't automatically through the data, because your systems aren't clever enough to tell you at the time, you can then go back to the data afterwards and have analysts looking for missed cases where there's repeat and vulnerable victims. So we're trying to wrap a sort of package around it to improve the performance. But I do agree with your point, and it goes to what I was saying at the start about data and focus and prioritisation. We know in policing that crime falls unevenly. It falls unevenly on communities, it falls unevenly on geography, and it falls unevenly on victims, and a small number of victims suffer a large proportion of crime, and being sharper at spotting them is both better in terms of supporting them as people and also more effective in terms of tackling crime.
Okay, so that is helpful to know. However, our briefing suggests that whilst lots of officers have had training on Thrive, it does, kind of reading between lines, seem like lots of people don't understand what they're using it for. And so I think that comment that you made earlier about moving to action rather than words, how are those staff and officers that are using it actually understanding either why they're being trained in it or how to turn that into something useful operationally?
Yeah. So I think we've trained 85% of the people in it so far. Our training of Thrive was delayed partly because of the resource pressures. Excuse me, I don't want to cough down the microphone. That would be very unpleasant. So about 85% have been trained so far. We delayed it because of the pressures. So I think it does lengthen the call handling time. So this is tied into filling those vacancies, the question the chair asked, and getting those extra posts in will make it easier for people to use the skills we're giving them. So we are on that process of going from fairly low compliance with it to having it fully in place. So I haven't got the data you've got, but that level of training point I agree with, and that's part of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. And my next question is to the Deputy Mayor. So in what way are you working with the Met to ensure that repeat victims of crime receive a good service and that they're taking every opportunity to reduce repeat victimisation?
Thanks a lot. I would just like to sort of reiterate that point around the capacity within METCC and the importance of that, because you all know that when you can see calls, a call, somebody that's taking the calls, when they can see the calls coming in, the calls stacking up, even if they've probably been trained, it's going to be difficult to spend longer on that call when you've got too many the calls coming in, you've not got the capacity. And you may remember in the Mayor's budget this year, he put aside £5 million in order to be able to enable the Met to recruit into METCC. So it's one of those things in terms of what we have been doing over the years in terms of knowing where there's an issue and actually investing to try to improve that. Well, the recruitment's underway at the moment. In terms of what we are doing with MOPAC and the Victims Commissioner around repeat victims and ensuring that the victim's voice and vulnerability is really properly understood by the Metropolitan Police, clearly there's oversight around what's happening with METCC and the very particular issues in the Peel report, which you've asked about, on Thrive, which is very clear that Thrive is not being implemented in the way that it should be. But also alongside that, there is the Victims Commissioner and the Victims Reference Group is working very closely with the Metropolitan Police in terms of that victim's voice going in and understanding the experience of victims, which is very important. But MPS is also currently piloting a victims needs assessment question in South Area BCU, which is different to Thrive, separate to Thrive, because clearly that's not where the calls are coming in, but it is in order to enable frontline police officers to really be able to ask the right questions, understand the victim's needs, and therefore also understand their vulnerability and as to whether they are repeat victims or not.
Thank you. Again to you, Deputy Mayor. The Mayor has invested in efforts to improve the support provided to victims, and yet the satisfaction levels are quite static still. Can you explain why this is and what specific steps MOPAC is taking to address this?
The victim satisfaction has, as with trust and confidence, has also been on a steady decline over the last couple of years. And again, there's the issue of oversight. We have, I chair the Oversight Board, which on an annual basis has victims as its main focus and topic. And actually this Friday we've got the Oversight Board and its focus is victims, and Claire Waxman will be will be with me for that Oversight Board. In order to be able to look at the data, delve beneath the data and really understand what is happening, we have also undertaken some some research and analysis of what is happening, for example, in TDIU, where it's all dealt with over the telephone or the internet. And we have seen, in particular, victim satisfaction being particularly poor within TDIU. What we have done is worked with the Metropolitan Police and put in place, they have put in place through some of the work that we've been supporting them on, is something as simple as a callback has made a huge difference to victim satisfaction. And I know that that's been looked at and reviewed at the moment in terms of rolling that out for everybody that is phoning into the Met. However, of course, that's capacity, isn't it? And you need the capacity and the people in place to be able to do that. Also, we've worked with Victims Commission, and the victims team have worked with Metropolitan Police around one of the things, and you may well come on to this because it's also in the appeal report, is the non-compliance with the Victims Code of Practice. And one of the things about that is that the victims don't know what they're right, but they're not yet rights, but what they should be, their expectations should be of the Met, but also the criminal justice system. And the Victims Commission and the team have worked very closely to develop a leaflet. We know that when that leaflet gets into the hand of the victims, their satisfaction increases. So one of the things we're working with the Met at the moment is how do we ensure that leaflet is distributed and the victims get it.
So just quickly on that, whilst we were at the interim City Hall, we had the Victims Commissioner there, and there was an exchange about the materials that the police were producing to give to victims of crime. But I guess the question is about, what are police doing beyond giving that information? So what changes in practice could there be or should there be to make sure that victims have higher satisfaction levels?
So Mark may want to come in on this, but it's really clear that there's the information, being given the right information and knowing where that is and how to, what you can do with that information is incredibly important. But we also know, and I'm sure Claire will have talked about this, having that contact and having that regular contact from police officers during the course of your investigation is incredibly important. And we know that that's not happening enough within the Metropolitan Police, and that does impact on victim satisfaction. We have been working, and one of the manifesto commitments from the Mayor was to explore the business case for a Victims Care Hub. We are working on that business case to look at how can this be transformed. But in the meantime, we've worked with Claire and with the Witness Care Unit within the Metropolitan Police to really look at what is happening and to review what is happening. And there's a review underway at the moment to make practical steps from the letters that are written out, from the information that's given, but also actually keeping in contact with the victim. These things can make a real difference to victim satisfaction. They're not the only thing. We also know that the system as a whole, not just the Met, but for the criminal justice system as well, is causing huge problems for victim satisfaction because of the court backlogs and the real difficulties within the criminal justice system at the moment.
Thank you. And Commissioner, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I think there's reliability, information and follow-up are themes that come out of that, aren't there? There's the basic reliability of, do we turn up promptly and when we said we would, and I talked about response times, etc. And that goes to this. There's then sort of on top of the obvious points about handling, but then there's giving people the right information. It's interesting that the victim care leaflet, the people who get it have 78% satisfaction. The people who don't receive it have 56% satisfaction. It's fairly obvious, but the sort of the starkness of that gap is very obvious. At the moment, we're managing to only give it out a third of the time, though. So, I mean, you can see, so this goes back to sort of basic quality of service and trying to systemise things that we know work. And then in terms of follow-up, that sense that victims don't always know what's happened to their case and the follow-up. So just that sort of updating and callback procedure having a big effect is part of that. And I do like the idea of us finding a way to sort of jointly bring together the police responsibilities in victim care and sort of work that sort of Victims Commission and MOPAC, sort of third sector organisations and others can do. I think finding a way to sort of scale that up and join that up would be really powerful.
Okay, and then finally, Commissioner, there are particular areas, I mean, there are a number of areas of concern, but in particular issues such as rape and domestic abuse have really high attrition rates for victims of those crimes. And I'm just wondering, off the back of this exchange, what thoughts you might have around the Met understanding why victims might withdraw from an investigation process. I appreciate you've only been in post for a few weeks, but I don't know how we might fill that gap, because obviously investigations falling apart or not being seen through to completion is a real issue for justice being
I
delivered.
completely agree with you. I think let's be really candid. I think we are part way through getting to a stage where sort of violence against women and girls, which, let's face it, is largely male violence against women and children. We're partway through a journey to get that to the right degree of seriousness with which we take it and how we do it. And it's not through a lack of appetite, but it takes the police service, the justice system, a time to sort of to really catch up with where we ought to be. There's lots of fantastic work going on, but there are real sort of challenges in the system. I think we're seeing that some of the services that support victims are struggling in terms of capacity, and I know MOPAC are looking at the commissioning of that. I think our investigations are working hard to improve their pace and quality. I think it's been sort of reported that we tried a model, as I understand it, 4 or 5 years ago, where we brought together the different functions like so child abuse teams and rape teams in terms of investigation, and frankly we found that didn't help, and actually we sort of re-specialised and segregated that out, which is having some positive effects, and we're seeing our rape detection rates and others rising, but they're still a long way below where one would wish them to be, but at least they're going in the right direction. So there's lots of quality issues. I'm particularly concerned at the moment about speed. I think, and I can't completely understand, but I can try and imagine sort of victims of something which is so intrusive and so personal and so difficult. Your resilience to sort of to see through a justice process is going to be affected by your sense of how quick it's going to be, or how long you're going to have this hanging over you, that waiting for a court appearance. And I think there are issues around the approach to the changing approach to charging that CPS have taken through COVID, and there are issues about court backlogs, which I think there are multiple factors which are slowing the process down. And I mean, some of the cases which have been deferred as a result of the recent barrister strike you've got cases which are, I think, 18 months and beyond old, and they've now been, the court listings lost, and they've been dropped another year or more into the future. And that's just inhuman to expect sort of victims to carry that sort of prospect of a court over that period of time. So I think there are some definitely some things that we need to do better on, and we're working hard on that, and we will keep doing that. But there's some real complex system issues here as well, which I'm really concerned about. And Sophie is very vigorous in her chairing of the London Criminal Justice Board on these issues.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sorry, can I just add a couple of last things on, particularly around your question, because we are doing some I'll be quick, I promise.
Thank you.
We are doing, MOPAC's Evidence and Insight team are doing some specific research around victims' attrition and why victims, what are the reasons and where do victims withdraw. And of course there's Operation Soteria, which was developed within the Met, really looking at the changes to the way in which the, not just the Met, but nationally police investigate rape, which should, and I do hope will, improve victims' experience, but really, really importantly, improve prosecutions.
And it's been much more offender focused in that space, which I think is really important.
Okay, thank you. It'd be really great to see some of that once it's ready.
Lovely, thank you. We're moving on to our next section. If I can ask colleagues to keep within the remit of the section, it's investigating crime, and that is being started again by Assembly Member Mahoma. Oh, I'm on to Anchor already. Oh, you just did all of them. Right, no wonder I'm thinking, what is she talking about? All right, Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. First of all, let me say hello, Commissioner, and to the Deputy Mayor.
Hello.
And I echo the comments made earlier on by colleagues of what a tremendous work the Metropolitan Police do and how much we appreciate that. We're just exploring this morning the issues which are of concern, right, so that we can improve the service. Of course. And one is about, I think my colleague this does, talking about Thrive, right, that the report by HMIC says, by the peer report said that we weren't doing very much about Thrive. And you talked about how training is being rolled out. Of course, giving training is something different from having the culture of actually adopting Thrive. I was like the difference between knowing what to do and doing it. And the question I'm asking is, how will you embed the culture of Thrive into the organisation?
So I think it's a very good point. So I mean, firstly, people need to have the skills. So as I say, we've got to 85% people trained, but then you need to have the capacity to do it properly, because I think the biggest effect on culture is it's one thing asking people to do something, but actually if their job doesn't provide time to do it, then that's quite a big issue. So hence the recruitment points we've made earlier on. It's like all other areas. It's about being relentless about following through in terms of performance and accountability. So once we've got the training and the resources there, we have to be relentless in terms of dip sampling calls, following through, checking it, and making sure that people are doing what we're asking them to do. It's not fair to be relentless when they don't have the time, but once they've got the time to do it, then there should be absolute expectation of it.
Okay, thank you. And which brings me to the next question, is about how often are police officers taking off the frontline duties to investigate crime, and what impact is it having on local policing?
Yeah, so the point about demand, I think more generally, is and having to stabilise what we're doing. There's too much abstraction from neighbourhood policing teams to backfill on investigations or response teams. Response team officers taken off to do crime investigations. So it's quite a complex picture of the way the resources are currently being managed, and I do want to stabilise that. I don't have a particular number to answer to your question. As I understand it, over the last few years, a model has been sort of moved towards where we've tried to have response officers owning more of the investigation and following it through, and there are lots of benefits in that, improving the investigative skills and the sort of the immediate investigation at the scene. I think there are also some challenges in terms of, frankly, it's hard for people who are working 24/7 shifts and nights to continue to manage a crime workload. And sort of, you can't really make sensible inquiries with victims of crime if you're working from, I know, 10 p.m. to sort of 7 a.m. at sort of some of the time. So there are different approaches being trialled across the Met from what I've seen so far in terms of how to balance that workload, and that's one of the things we need to get on top of. But I don't have a specific detailed plan yet, but we are working on it.
Sophie, are you concerned about that officers are having to be taken away from frontline policing to take on investigative roles?
If that's the issue, I would be concerned. But I think some investigation of some crimes is a frontline role. So maybe it's a sort of false dichotomy that you're talking about. But when this was introduced, as I'm sure everyone around, people have been on the PCC for a while, it was as part of the BCU restructure, and one of the pluses that was meant to come out of this was that which we have not yet seen really, is it was meant to give a better service to victims, because it meant there wouldn't be, it wouldn't be more than one officer that would be handling their case. But also the fact that I think the Met was one of the only forces in the country at that time that didn't deliver this model of policing. It was an unusual thing that actually the emergency response only ever responded and then immediately handed over the cases. I think as part of the work that Sir Mark's talking about, really need to understand why it doesn't appear to have worked in the way it has worked in other parts of the country, whether that's about resources, whether that's about capacity, and actually, the shift pattern being one thing, but also actually, if you never have the time to investigate because you're just continually responding, whether that's the issue or it's actually the model that's wrong.
Great, thank you. Commissioner, it says that in 2021, 131,334 crimes were screened out within 24 hours of the crime taking place. Are you concerned about this, and do you want to see a reduction on that?
I'd have to have a look at the numbers and the context. I think we have to focus on which crimes are solvable, which are most impact on victims, and make sensible decisions about where to apply our effort to solve as many crimes as possible and help victims. Whether that's the right number, I don't have a view yet.
Okay. Well, let me just put another figure to you. Over 43% of recorded crimes in London are closed without a suspect being identified. This is quite a higher figure than the national figure of 36%. What do you think about that?
I'd like to solve more crimes. There's a range of factors, aren't there, behind crimes in terms of whether they're solvable. It's police work, it's what victims see, it's the different mix of crime. We have a different mix of crime to other areas, so it's you can't just look at a number like that. But of course it's significant. I do want to improve the detection rates of crime. We're not in no force in the country allocates all or even the majority of its crimes for follow-up investigation. Everyone is trying to select the right crimes to follow through on because of the severity of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, the solvability of it. And I do think there's some ways to improve on that. But I'm not going to sort of pluck a number out the air and sort of guess at a right number for London.
Right. And over the years, are you satisfied that we've increased our investigative capacity adequately in London, or do you think this is an area which you need to work more on?
If I had a magic wand, I'd like to increase our capacity in everything we do in London. There's a constant balance, isn't there, between investigation and response and community policing and specialist functions like organised crime, and we're constantly wrestling with getting the right balance across that. And of course, over the last few years, the sort of previous leadership team, it's been even harder with the training and recruiting of new officers. It's very welcome to have so many to be growing our numbers again, but that creates sort of challenges in terms of experience, because they tend to get their training and experience in only a small part of the organisation, the local policing part of the organisation, and so that burden falls very heavily there, and that affects the quality of what we do as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Garrett.
Hello. Sticking with this question about investigative capacity.
Yes.
Commissioner, if I could ask you about, so there are supervisor reviews of investigations, which I understand don't occur in all investigations. Do you know why that is? Is it your intention that they should? And do you understand what the constraints are on that not happening?
I've got a sort of headline understanding of it at the moment. Of course they should. One of the things that we're looking at in terms of our resources at the moment is the balance of where supervisors are in the Met. Sergeants and inspectors are critical, aren't they, to how well we perform. They set, both in terms of the standards issues we were talking about earlier on, they set the tone and the standards in terms of integrity, but they also follow through and make sure we're doing a good job on behalf of the public. At the moment, in my mind, our supervisory ratios are too high in local policing. Some people are supervising far too many officers, particularly in a context, say, when we've got many officers who've joined in the last year or two. So that's one thing I'm looking to balance, and sort of looking at whether we have the balance of our supervisors spread between specialist areas and with and local policing areas is right. So it is something for me to pay attention to.
One of the things that the HMI flagged up, which was a bit of a concern, was that sometimes this supervisory process, which is supposed to be, as the name suggests, overseeing something that is essentially would happen even if they weren't there, they're performing more of a sort of tutoring, teaching, training role because of this problem you just described of so many new officers. I mean, is that something you're aware of, and is that something that you're tackling?
Yeah,
because it obviously it highlights a lack of training, doesn't it?
I'm not sure it highlights that. I don't think it does highlight a lack of training. I think sort of police officer training has always been based on you learn a certain amount in the classroom and before you start, and then over your first couple of years you get a lot of coaching and tutoring and support in that process. The challenge is when you have so many new recruits, what would once have been done by the experienced PCs on the unit, there aren't so many experienced PCs, so I imagine what's happening there is it's drawing in sergeants' time to help fill that, which is, it's good that they're doing it, but it's just, I think, an illustration of the sort of stretch, the welcome challenge of having more officers, but the speed we're bringing them in creates that stretch in terms of how you train and develop them.
Particularly in light of what you were just saying before about the high ratios. So
exactly.
You've got fewer sergeants doing the supervising and having it becoming a more intensive role. So do you have a sort of, I don't know if there's a timeline on, I mean, that's a problem that sort of self-solves, doesn't it, over time, that the inexperienced officers become experienced, and the recruitment surge that we have obviously isn't going to continue at that rate. I don't know, at what point would you see that problem sort of working itself out as the inexperienced officers become experienced officers?
So if we did nothing about it, it's probably a couple of years away before it just sorts itself out.
Okay.
Therefore, doing nothing about it's probably not a good idea. So that's why I'm sort of got a piece of work happening at the moment that I've already tasked out, which is coming back to me soon, about whether there's a different way to sort of organise where our sergeants and inspectors are in the organisation, so we put more weight where there's least experience.
So that's sort of something you're actively
looking at. So
okay.
we were literally talking about it at a board meeting last week, and there's a piece of work going on, and so I'm sure we will make some changes. I just need to see options on that.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor, if I could just ask you on that same question, is there something that MOPAC is looking at in terms of the sort of skills and training of those, particularly looking on the investigation side, making sure that those new officers that are coming into that area of policing are getting skills and training?
I think the main way in which we are looking at that is through the Operation Soteria work, which we helped develop in terms of particularly around rape, but also looking at domestic abuse as well. One of the things we are looking at as well is how we have some better oversight and scrutiny around supervisory ratios, and then also the quality of that. And that's something that's a piece of work in progress at the moment, because really recognise this as an issue. Don't have the answer yet as to the best way of having transparency around this and having the oversight.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you whether there was something that you were looking for the Met to do that they aren't already doing, but it sounds like you don't quite know yet, and we're waiting for that piece of work.
So yes, in terms of rape and domestic abuse, particularly around rape, yes, we've had Operation Soteria within the Metropolitan Police, and we are waiting for the sort of recommendations to be really scoped and looked at properly within the Met. Work is really underway. I'm not saying it's not underway. So very, very aware of what we need to keep oversight on and what needs to happen within that. What I'm saying is, everyone talks about supervisory ratios being an issue. Clearly it is. What we need to work out is what's the best way of having oversight of that we're not just looking at the numbers, but we're looking at the quality as well.
Okay. I suppose what I meant was, if I asked you the question, what should the Met be doing that they're not already doing, it sounds like you can't answer that right now, but we're waiting for that piece of work. So, sorry if I missed, did you say when that's due to land?
Well, it's underway at the moment, so we haven't yet got a timeline on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So we're now going on to our last section, which is protecting vulnerable people. That's led by Assemblymember Devonish.
Chair, can I just say, I know we've slipped past 12 o'clock. I've really got to get away by sort of 15:15, if that's okay. So I don't know how we
get away by 15:15. Very short questions,
Thank
please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry if it's my fault for being too long-winded at all.
No. We're very happy to hear what you have to say, but let's do this quickly, please.
Right, there's a hint from both of us here, Commissioner, from the Chair. So how are the BCU supporting to dedicate time to implementing the changes set out in the Met's plan to improve the way it investigates incidents involving vulnerable people?
So I think we've touched on some of this in terms of identifying repeat victims, which is a big part of it. I mean, there are particular crime types where we pay particular attention to, such as hate crime, which you've asked about earlier on. And I mean, most importantly comes the identification, doesn't it, of the most vulnerable. So it starts at that start of the process, and the points I made earlier about the Thrive model, where we've done most of the training and now need to embed its use, are critical to that.
Great. And what action is the Met taking to address one of my biggest concerns over the years, that public protection staff are generally inexperienced and don't stay long, and of course people do move around more generally the Met rather quickly?
So I have a slightly different perception. I think a lot of people, the people who go into public protection, a lot of them stay there a long time. I was talking to an officer, she'd been in there I think 18 or 20 years just the other day at Holborn. I think at the moment we've got a lot of new officers going to there as part of that recruitment, so it is an unusual moment in time. And as part of the detective learning, they do tend to move between different departments. So that recruitment challenge, that's another manifestation that you're seeing some movement through that environment. But the long-term picture is people are massively committed to those areas. And I think it's extraordinary what they do to sort of deal with those sorts of crimes long-term. But they do tend to do that. The challenge at the moment, say, is that sort of fluidity created by this big surge in recruitment.
Maybe you could write to us in terms of figures, because I've always thought that people do move around far too much in the Met. I mean, do you have figures of different roles in terms of average lengths of service in post? But perhaps you could write to us, because I've been told by the chair that I'm sure she's got to move on.
I am, so if you have anything that we could have.
Okay, I'll see what we've got available on that.
That's very good of you. Thank you. Assembly Member Russell, as quick as you can, please.
Absolutely. Commissioner, just looking at the way that public protection staff are or are not valued for their high levels of risk management and for the nuances of dealing with some of the most vulnerable victims, do you agree with the HMI that there's a problem in this area?
So I haven't seen the specific comments you're referring to. I think the challenge I've already spoken about is that challenge of the experience levels that come with. We've got lots of new recruits going to that area, which is a challenging role, and it's not a problem if the ratios are right. But I say because of the volume that we're doing is quite significant, and of course we have been growing the number of people doing functions like RASO, which is also really important, because I think it's about 60% growth in the last 5 years in that area in terms of the workload, and the previous 5 years I think it was even bigger growth. So we're trying to deal with more and more capacity into that department, and we're training and recruiting lots of new people. So I'm sure the HMIC criticisms are fair, but we're doing the best we can with the situation available to us, and I am keen that it stabilises. So I think I was just looking at my notes here, we've got 200 extra officers going to CSUs, and I think 68 into some of the MASH work that's trying to stabilise the performance in those areas, all trying to deal with this growth. So we're bringing direct entry detectives into the area, we're transferring experienced detectives into it. It's a critical area, and you're all very demanding properly on behalf of the public in terms of improving our performance in violence against women and girls. And this is the sort of stretch that to some degree you're bound to see. And that's not me being complacent, but I'm wrestling with growing something as quickly as I can, and that's never going to be completely perfect.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that it talks about is that, yes, these multi-agency safeguarding hubs it says that they have a limited capability for risk-based decision-making, and they tend to share all the available information with safeguarding authorities, so actually potentially overwhelming them, yes, and with the risk that then you actually miss something that's really urgent. So is that something that you would kind of have a look at?
So there's a couple of things going on at the moment on that. So firstly, I know across the Met we try and look at a sort of a common approach where we agree the threshold of risk. Frankly, once you don't refer everything, you can guarantee that one of the cases you don't refer will end up in something awful happening, and there'll be an inquest, and that's part of the challenge. So the caution to refer everything is understandable. I think the answer lies in this in terms of data and science and getting better at risk assessment. And we've one of the things I've put in place. We've brought in a chief scientific officer, a very, very eminent criminology professor who's now working in the organisation and very experienced at using data. And so if we can find better ways to spot out of the tens of thousands of cases, so if you just pick domestic abuse, the tens of thousands of cases in the system from people who've been convicted in recent years, how do you spot the ones who are the victims are most vulnerable or the offenders are most dangerous or the children in the families where that's I think there's a lot of evidence that data and analytics can contribute to the decision making and help us manage the workloads in a way that work for us and our partners, because overloading partners, as you say, with multiple referrals doesn't help anybody.
Indeed. So you think data is going to be the solution?
It's a big part of it. I mean, if you've got if you've got
to kind of help people to prioritise what's worth.
Because otherwise you've got thousands, you've got so many tens of thousands of cases, you end up with people sat there trying to stack the cases, and it doesn't necessarily work. I mean, I've seen it when I was in the counter-terrorism world, leading the national response there. Counter-terrorism went from a casework model where individuals can decide on the risk, where you have to start using data to be part of that solution. You still want human decision-making on top of it, but actually the numbers get so big, you can't build a team that big, and that's what we've got to apply in this world, because we have to be better at finding the more dangerous men who predate on women and children, and better at spotting the most vulnerable. And we won't do it simply by throwing people at it.
And just one final extra question. Do you think that data approach might actually help in terms of, I mean, we've seen some really shocking strip searching of children and cases of within the Met. Do you think that data approach to risk assessment might actually also help reduce that? There might
be scope in custody. I think just on that point, just to put my sort of view on the record, it is clear that this critical power, we overused it and misused it. And that just need to be absolutely frank about that. I've been scrutinising that. The amount of use of it, both I think on the street and in custody, has pretty much halved on children and adults over recent months. So I think that the response of people to it has been really good. It is, of course, a critical power. I mean, sadly, we do have children stabbing each other to death on the streets of London, and we're trying to intervene in that. So we are, and people put large amounts of drugs and weapons in their underwear and elsewhere. So we are going to have times where we do need to use the power. It's critical. But when we are trusted with a sensitive power like that, we need to use it as carefully and responsibly as possible. And clearly we weren't, and that's why it's been clamped down on, and I'm pleased by the much more focused use of it.
Thank you very much.
Assembly Member Ahmed, I'm afraid you've only got 2 minutes left. If you want to ask both our guests, if you just ask Sir Mark to start with, then come back to me, and then when Sir Mark's gone, we'll ask Sophie.
Thank you very much, Chair. Going back to the issue of strip searching, yes, and we've just touched on that. When Assistant Commissioner Rolfe was here recently talking about the intimate body strip searching, we talked about training that was being done, because the real concern about those awful cases is that there were protocols already in place that were not being followed by officers, safeguarding protocols that were effectively being ignored. Can you outline how far the training has now taken place? It was encouraging for you to earlier say that, you know, that those critical powers have now been reduced to half previous usage, but where are we with the training, and can you give us an assurance that safeguarding and the dignity of children, whatever the issue, will always be at the heart of intimate body strip searches?
Well, I think we need to have two things at the heart of it: the sort of safeguarding and safety, because I know people carrying weapons and hiding them in intimate places is sort of needs thinking about as well. But those two issues about safety and safeguarding have to be front and centre. The numbers show that there's a lot more thought and care into it. The briefings I've had suggest that we are doing better at getting, wherever possible, getting appropriate adults and thinking about those wider issues, and also thinking about actually these are young people involved in crime. Are they best off treated as a criminal or a victim in those circumstances? And those judgments are quite finely balanced. But I think that's we're making a lot of progress on all of those, but we need to keep working on it. I agree with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sir Mark, thank you very much on behalf of the entire committee for coming and sharing your views with us. absolutely agree that we've got to support our very brave police officers. We really must all be doing that. And I do hope that you're able to visit us more frequently than perhaps we've had in the past, because if we can either see you or obviously Dame Lynn Owens, but we would like to see you in the future. We've also got to go over the Peel report more thoroughly. You'll understand. If you want to go now while I go through
very
proceedings,
grateful.
thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, I would like to thank our guests for attending the meeting today and for participating in this discussion. Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion and the monthly reports received by MOPAC? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Agreed. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 22-23 Assembly year? Noted. Can I also ask the committee to note the cover letter and summons notice sent to the Mayor of London in his capacity as the occupant of MOPAC following agreement at the committee meeting on the 29th of September? Noted. Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Wednesday, the 2nd of November 2022 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall.